My fellow Singaporeans, this video is most probably the most important video that you must watch to understand what is really going on in Singapore. I'm going to show you how the PAP uses what I term the wage CPF HDB trinity to stab Singaporeans in the back. Now, things weren't always so bad in Singapore. Under the PAP old guards, in the 1970s up until the early 1980s, Singapore was in a good position. From 1972 to 1985, the wage share in Singapore grew from 37% to almost 48%. The wage share is the proportion of the GDP that goes to wages. The proportion that doesn't go to wages goes into profits. So up until 1985, Singaporeans were receiving higher and higher wages. The wage share increased to nearly 48% in 1985. It dropped after the 1985 recession and fell to about 42% before it started picking up again to 45.4% in 1992. So you see, up until 1985, Singaporeans were getting better and better. Now indeed, if you look at the CPF contribution rates, Singaporeans were paying more and more into the CPF. We were setting aside more for our retirement funds. The CPF contribution rate increased to 50% in 1985 before dropping off after the 1985 recession. But more importantly, the CPF interest rates also grew from 1955 to 1986. It grew to the highest rates of 6.5% in 1986. Singaporeans have never seen such a high interest rate ever since. Indeed, income inequality also fell during earlier years. Up until the late 1970s, income inequality dropped to its lowest ever in Singapore. We have never seen such a low income inequality ever since. This means that Singapore during the earlier years was a much fairer and equal place than it is today. And the share of income that went to the richest 10% was maintained at between 30% to 35% up until 1986. Singapore was a more equal society in the earlier years of our nation. Now, according to the PAP, the average wage share grew from 41.8% in the 1980s to 41.9% in the 1990s, to 42.5% in the 2000s. But if you look at the 42.5% wage share that Singapore has, it is actually the lowest among the high-income countries. What this means is that Singaporeans earn the lowest wages among the developed countries. In countries which have a similar cost of living to Singapore, the wage share is between 55 to 60%. So what this means is that Singaporeans are losing about 20% of our wages. And as I had written before, for a low-income earner who earns $800, he or she is losing up to 75% of his or her wages. For a Singaporean who earns a medium income, he or she is losing up to 50% of his or her wages. Now, there is actually some discrepancy between what the PAP has reported in wage share and the actual wage share. According to the PAP, in the 1980s, the wage share was 41.8%. However, in 1985, wage share was as high as 48%. The average wage share in the 1980s would actually be closer to 43% instead of 41.8%. Also, in the 1990s, the PAP reported that there is a wage share of 41.9%. However, in 1992, wage share was as high as 45.4%. The average wage share in the 1990s should be closer to 43% instead of 41.9%. So what this means is that instead of what the PAP has reported, that wage share grew from 41.8% to 42.5%, wage share could actually have dropped from 43% to 42.5%. This means that since the 1980s, Singaporeans are earning lower wages. So in the 1970s and in the early 1980s, the PAP old guards were taking care of Singaporeans. However, it all changed after that. In 1994, the wage share was suddenly pushed down to 40% for no reason. And in 2004, the same thing happened. The wage share was pushed down to 39% for no reason, and the 39% wage share that Singaporeans were receiving was actually the lowest ever since the early 1980s. Now remember these 2 days, 1994 and 2004. They were when things started to go haywire in Singapore. In fact, if wage share had continued on the trend in the 1970s and early 1980s, the wage share in Singapore could be as high as 57% today. And what this means is that for a low-income earner, instead of earning only $800, he or she should be earning $3,000. And for a medium income earner, instead of $3,000, he or she should be earning $6,000. Now the question is, why would the PAP push down the wage share of Singaporeans in 1994 and 2004? And why did the PAP maintain the wage share of Singaporeans at 40%, even though in other countries with the same cost of living, they are receiving a wage share of up to 60%? This means that Singaporeans are severely underpaid. Now, but the low wage share doesn't apply to all Singaporeans. For the richest 10% in Singapore, since 1995, they have seen their share of income explode from 30% to 42% today. And for the richest 5%, they have seen their income share explode from 22% in 1995 to 31% today. The richest 5% in Singapore has actually seen an even faster growth in their income. Now, as I had written before, the increase in the share of income to the rich follows the increase in the income inequality by a year. What this means is that if income inequality increases this year, the share of income that the rich will receive will increase next year. So if you go back, the share of income for the rich exploded in 1995. This means that income inequality actually started in 1994. Yet again, 1994. Remember this year. Now what we have seen so far is that in 1994, the PAP intentionally pushed down the wage share of Singaporeans. At the same time, the income share that goes to the rich exploded from 1994. Now there is something even more disgusting than this. In 1994, the PAP didn't even bother to hide their greed. In 1994, the PAP decided to pack the ministers' salaries to 2/3 of the average of the top 24 people in 6 professions. In 1994, the PAP started paying themselves million-dollar salaries. So did everything happen in 1994? Did the PAP started stabbing Singaporeans in the back in 1994 and had no shame for it? Now as mentioned, up until the early 1980s, Singaporeans saw their CPF contribution rate grow to 50%, which means that we were able to set aside more for our retirement. But more importantly, the CPF interest rate also grew to its highest ever at 6.5%. This means that in the 1970s and in the early 1980s, our CPF was growing at a much faster rate, and Singaporeans were able to save enough for retirement. However, again, all this changed in 1994. After the recession in 1985, the CPF contribution rate dropped to 35%. However, by 1994, the CPF employee contribution increased to a high peak of 20%. In 1994, the CPF increased to a high peak of 40%. And when you look at the interest rates, in 1994, the CPF interest rates dropped to its lowest at 2.5%. Singaporeans had not received a 2.5% interest rate since 1963. So what happened was that in 1994, the PAP pushed up the CPF contribution rate to a peak of 40% and pushed down the CPF interest rates to a low of 2.5%. This means that the PAP was forcing Singaporeans to put more and more of our wages into the CPF, and they were giving back to us much lesser than what they should be. Now the CPF interest rate did rise again after 1994, but in 1999, the CPF contribution rate dropped to 30% after the 1998 recession. And with it, the CPF interest rate fell back to 2.5% interest, and it has remained at a low of 2.5% interest ever since. However, since then, the CPF contribution rate has only kept increasing, and it has increased to another high peak of 37% this year. So again, the PAP is making Singaporeans pay more and more out of our wages while they give us a very low interest rate of 2.5%. So much so that what Singaporeans contribute to the CPF is the highest anywhere in the world. And the interest rates that we receive is most probably the lowest in the world as well. Now, as I had written in the previous article, the CPF is not our CPF. The HDB is not our home. The PAP has taken our CPF and turned it into their bank. Similarly, the HDB is now their bank as well. what the PAP has done is that they have forced Singaporeans to deposit 37% of our wages into the CPF bank. Then, they have created the HDB bank and make Singaporeans deposit our CPF savings into the HDB bank via the housing mortgage. Next, the PAP sets a high deposit level in the HDB bank by increasing the HDB flat prices so that Singaporeans are forced to transfer even more CPF savings into the HDB bank. The PAP also gives a very low 2.5% interest on our CPF savings inside the CPF bank. Then what the PAP does is that they take our CPF and turn it into their CPF bank and tell us that they are going to lend us our money and force us to pay a 2.5% interest on it. Now this 2.5% interest is what the PAP makes us pay on top of the mortgage that we already pay for the flats. So what the PAP is saying is that if you want to take this money out to pay for your mortgage, you have to pay another 2.5% accrued interest on top of the mortgage interest back to the CPF. Effectively, you are paying a 5.1% interest if you want to buy a HDB flat. But this is our money. Why should we be paying interest on our money? And why should the PAP take our money and turn it into their money? Finally, the PAP puts in a minimum deposit level, which they call the CPF minimum sum, and force Singaporeans to put in this minimum sum before we are able to withdraw from their CPF bank. So by last year, the CPF has accumulated more than $250 billion, and how much does the HDB has? 300 billion? No one knows. Because the PAP is unwilling to let Singaporeans know how much they are using the HDB to earn from Singaporeans. So what's the net effect? Singaporeans, we suffer, we cannot save and we cannot retire. Now all because the PAP has used the CPF and the HDB to cut down on Singaporeans and to undermine us. So here's how it works. The PAP gives Singaporeans only a 42% wage share of GDP. And the PAP forces Singaporeans to sacrifice the largest proportion of our wages into CPF. Now take note, our wages are already the lowest among the developed countries and yet we are paying the highest contribution. Do you see what that means? That means we have a pathetic purchasing power. So from our CPF, the PAP increases the prices of HDB flats to force us to pay a high proportion of our CPF into the housing mortgage, and then they take our money, turn it into their CPF bank, make us borrow from it, and make us pay a 2.5% interest on it. And finally, for the rest of the money that is left inside the CPF, the PAP puts in the CPF minimum sum so that it traps the money inside and we cannot withdraw our money. Well, so what happens? Our CPF gone, gone, gone. Now back to 1994, it was also when the PAP liberalized the housing market and allowed housing prices to be speculated outwards. So as housing prices increases, this depletes our CPF because we have to pay more out into the HDB mortgage as well as more into the CPF accrued interest which we have to pay on top of the HDB mortgage. Now as most of us would know by now, our CPF is invested in the Temasek Holdings and invested in the GIC. Temasek Holdings and GIC are the two investment firms that are owned by the government, or effectively by the PAP. Now in 1993, the Singapore Telecom or Singtel today was privatized and a huge sum was withdrawn from the CPF and invested into Singapore Telecom. Now Singtel is owned by the Temasek Holdings, so how much of our CPF was actually transferred into Singtel and how much of our CPF was actually returned back to Singaporeans, or was it even returned? So now if you look at the GIC, according to the GIC, they acknowledge that the GIC manages our CPF, but they claim that as to how the funds from CPF monies flow into the reserves, which could then be managed by either MAS, them, or Temasek, this is not made explicit to them. And you know what else they claim? They claim that the government neither directs nor interferes in the GIC's investment decisions. So get this, apparently the GIC invests your CPF, but they claim they do not know how your CPF is being invested. And second, the GIC claim that the PAP does not interfere in the GIC's investment decisions. The GIC claims that board of directors in the GIC is the one accountable. So it sounds like the government and the GICs are separate entities, but are they? No, they are not, because look at the board of directors on the GIC. Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister, is the chairman on the board of directors of GIC. The two Deputy Prime Minister, Tharman and Teo Chee Hean, are also directors on the GIC. Minister for Trade and Industry and Minister for Education are also the board of directors. In fact, On the board of directors are also the chairmen of the Singapore Exchange, DBS and UOB. Now these are banks which manage your wages. What this means is that your wages and your CPF are all controlled by the PAP. And guess who else? Lee Kuan Yew is also the senior advisor on the board of directors of the GIC. So the GIC might claim that they invest your CPF, but they have no idea whatsoever how your CPF is being used and invested because they are not the government. But guess what? The government is on the board of directors of GIC. The PAP is on the board of directors of the GIC. So the GIC might claim that the government does not interfere in their investment decision and that only the board is accountable. But guess who is on the board? The government is on the board. How can the PAP not be interfering in the decisions of the board? How can the GIC not know how our CPF is being invested? And not only that, the current president of Singapore is the ex-deputy chairman of GIC. Now, the fund managers in the GIC are also paid a fee to look after Singapore's foreign reserves. So what does this mean? Does this mean that for the ministers who are already earning millions of dollars from our taxpayers' money, are we also paying millions of dollars to them as fees from our CPF? Now, by now, the GIC and Temasek Holdings are the top 10 sovereign wealth funds in the world. So the GIC and Temasek Holdings might be very rich, but what about Singaporeans? According to Mr. Leong Tze Hian, nearly 90% of Singaporeans are not able to save and retire because we cannot meet the CPF minimum sum. So does it even make sense that the investment firms that the PAP owns are making so much money from our CPF, but Singaporeans are not able to save and retire at all because we do not have enough in our CPF? Does this even make sense? Why is it that the money that we supposedly own can help to make GIC and Temasek Holdings become so rich, but make Singaporeans so poor? Now, if we turn our attention to Temasek Holdings, by early 2008, Temasek's portfolio has grown to 114 billion. But by the end of 2008, Temasek Holdings had lost $58 billion. Now, to put this in context, in 2008, the CPF has accumulated a total of $151 billion. The $58 billion loss that Temasek made is 40% of the value of our CPF. Yet, in 2008, Singaporeans were only allowed to withdraw 11 billion from our CPF, or only 7% from our CPF. So the PAP is allowed to make a loss of 40% of the value of our CPF, but we are only allowed to withdraw a puny 7% from our CPF. Now, isn't the CPF supposed to be our money? In fact, last year, the CPF has accumulated $253 billion. And Singaporeans were only allowed to withdraw $15 billion, or only 5.9%. So something is really wrong here, right? The GIC and Temasek Holdings have become so rich, and we have put in so much money into the CPF so that they can use it for investments. But how much can Singaporeans take it out? We are only able to take peanuts out. Yet the PAP gives us very low interest rates on our CPF of between 2.5% and 4%. However, Temasek Holdings and GIC are earning 16% and 6.5% respectively. Now, this interest is earned on our money, which means that this interest should be returned back to us. And the interest that we are not getting back is actually a tax that Singaporeans are made to pay from our CPF. So get this, the PAP has made themselves the government. The PAP takes our CPF to invest. The PAP then creates the GIC and put themselves on the board of directors of the GIC. And the PAP can claim to tell us that they do not know how our CPF is being used. Now, it's a very fanciful story that they have concocted for you, haven't they? Such blatant deception and no shame at all. Now, it's amazing, this PAP. Now, so much so that Singaporeans have accumulated the largest pension reserves in comparison to the Asian tigers Japan and the United States. However, even though we have accumulated such a huge pension reserves, Singaporeans actually have the least adequate pension funds among the Southeast Asian countries after Indonesia. Singaporeans also have the least adequate pension funds as compared to the high-income countries. In fact, as compared to the high-income countries, Southeast Asian countries and the other Asian countries, Singaporeans also have the least adequate pension funds. So what's going on? Why has the PAP made us pay so much of our wages into the CPF, pay us so little interest on our CPF, and force us to give them our CPF for their investments, so much so that we do not have enough to retire on? Now, does this even make sense?
Now in this part of the video, you have seen how the PAP has forced you to give them your CPF so that they have accumulated one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. However, nearly 90% of Singaporeans are unable to retire. In the next part of the video, we will look at how the PAP uses your CPF, HDB and debt to lock Singaporeans into debts and entrap Singaporeans.
On the 3rd of May, we will be holding an event to advocate for the rights of Singaporeans for fair wages and rightful employment. Now Singaporeans, it is time that we stand up and we fight for ourselves. Now the PAP is unwilling to give Singaporeans fair wages, and the PAP is unwilling to enact laws to protect the employment of Singaporeans. We cannot take this sitting down. We need to speak up and we need to have a voice. If we are able to stand united, we will create a Singapore that we can be proud of. On 3rd of May, join us. Let's come together and create a society that will benefit all Singaporeans and protect all Singaporeans, and a Singapore that we can all be proud of.